Great. So I think we're going to get started. Thank you all so much for coming. Today, we are all here to learn about local food purchasing incentives. Today is session 2 of 2 of the state program Flash Talks. And we are going to hear from professionals in 5 different states about efforts that they are taking to incentivize local food in school meals. My name is Cassandra Bull. I am a policy consultant and your Flash Talk host today. I am consulting with Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems. My collaborator there is Colleen Matz, who is the Farm to Institution Specialist. And this is a joint project with the National Farm to School Network. And our collaborators there are Sunny Baker and Karen Spangler. Today, we are going to hear from 5 folks across the nation. They are Justin Carter of the Colorado Department of Education, Kate Wheeler from the Utah State Board of Education, Wendy Crawley from Michigan Department of Education, Connor Floyd from Vermont Agency of Education, and Sam from the Food Trust representing Pennsylvania. Our agenda today is I'll give a little introduction to local food purchasing incentives and our project. Then we'll have the 5 Flash Talks, and then we'll wrap it up with a Q&A. And just so all of you know, you can enter your questions in the chat throughout the session. We'll address them at the end, or our presenters will address them via chat during the hour. And whatever we don't get to, we will follow up via email. So about local food purchasing incentives, these are programs that provide additional funding to directly offset the cost of local foods. They are typically funded and operated at the state level, and they intend to increase purchasing of local foods in school and/or early childcare and education settings. So basically, state agencies will give money to child nutrition programs so that they can, or if they did, purchase local food from local farmers and producers. If there's anything I want you to take away from today, it's that each incentive is unique in its design and how it's administered, but there's sort of 2 main buckets of incentive programs. They are traditional and expanded. In a traditional incentive, basically it provides a specific reimbursement rate for child nutrition programs if they qualify for the incentive. And what that really means is that it only incentivizes or provides funds for food costs, whereas expanded incentives are typically grant-style programs that fund farm-to-school activities like staff training, equipment, and even education, as well as local food purchases. So keep that in mind. Here is a map of states that have implemented incentive programs. So pre-pandemic, 2001 was the first incentive in Maine. All the way up to 2019, there were 9 different states that had established incentives in some way. And then post-pandemic, from 2020 to 2023, we saw 7 additional states establish incentive programs. So that distinction is just to show that there's a rapid growth in support for a resilient food system and support for local food purchasing and this program in particular. And that's why we see a policy window for incentive programs. We see that they're growing, there's growing adoption and attention to the policies. We're also looking nationally at, the USDA has the Local Food for Schools Cooperative Agreement, which is rolling out this year. And that's very similar to a state incentive program model. And then additionally, we see another rapidly growing statewide program that involves school meals. Universal free meals is now in 8 states, and actually 2 of those states included local food incentive language in their universal meals bill. So it's something that we are keeping an eye on and seeing this policy window for incentives. That leads us to this project with Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems and National Farm to School Network. Our goals are to support local food purchasing incentives. We're supposed to support their stakeholders in all phases of development, whether they're planning or implementing these programs. We also want to increase awareness of incentives for general audiences and increase connections between state practitioners. So this flash talk is really aligned with those two last goals. And we're doing this through webinars like today and additional resources which are in development. If you're really interested in incentives, I want to share that there's 3 great resources already out there. The first is a landscape analysis of the national landscape of incentives and a state compendium, which has overviews of every state incentive program. That's my personal research, and it was released in October of last year. The next is the Center for Regional Food Systems conducted a national survey about needs and values of stakeholders for incentive programs. That was also released last fall. And then on the right here is the tried and true National Farm to School Network State Policy Handbook, which shares state policies, more than incentives, all different farm to school policies in all US states and territories from 2002 to 2020, and it's a great resource. Lastly, I want to share some other projects that involve regional or national incentive work. The first is a multi-state collaborative research project that seeks to understand the impacts of these incentive programs, and that's spearheaded by Colorado State University. The next is a relatively new incentive community of practice specific to the Northeast, and that is spearheaded by NOFA Vermont. And then lastly, we have here the National Farm to Institution Metrics Collaborative, and that's not specific to incentive programs, but there's a lot of folks that are research or administer incentives. And we talk a lot about tracking and metrics in relation to these programs. So that's my introduction. I want to call attention to the first session of our Flash Talk webinar series was last week, and the recording is available on National Farm to School Network's YouTube page. And there we had representatives from California, Connecticut, Maine, New Hampshire, and New York share their stories. And then later this month, we have a group discussion about a new local food tracking software project that's spearheaded from the Rhode Island Department of Education. Okay, now I'm going to pass it over to Justin Carter. Justin is the Farm to School Coordinator at the Colorado Department of Education, and he will be speaking about the local food program. Justin, take it away.
All right, thank you, Cassandra. It is great to be here today, everybody. And I'm going to be going over our signature incentive program, the local food program. Yeah, next slide. All right, so the local food program offers school districts, or sponsors as we call them, funding for the purchase of Colorado grown, raised, minimally processed, and value-added products. It is a state-funded program. It was signed into law by our legislature in May of 2019. We have been piloting the program for 3 years as a competitive grant that districts can apply for and then be accepted into. The first round of our pilot was interrupted by COVID, unfortunately, but those funds were reinstated in school year 2021-22. And we have now had 2 successful pilot years, and we are going into our 3rd with 31 districts this year. So to give you an idea of how the funding is structured for the program, it is based off of lunches that districts served the previous year. So the current funding basis is 5 cents per lunch a district serves in the previous year. So if that makes sense, just take the number of school lunches served, multiply it by 5, and that is the total amount of funding that the districts receive. The program prioritizes the purchase of raw and minimally processed products, but 25% of the funding districts receive can be used towards value-added products, things like salsas, breakfast burritos, breads, things like that. And then along with the funding for local foods, the program also includes technical assistance that has been administered by our nonprofit partner, Nourish Colorado. So Nourish conducts interviews with our participating sponsors, provides education on scratch cooking, knife skills training, helping schools get in contact with local vendors. And they have also created a lot of different resources for producers and schools alike. So, going forward in the fall of 2022, we hit a major milestone in Colorado with the passage of Healthy School Meals for All, which is a program that provides those free school lunches like Cassandra talked about. And that includes a provision that will expand our local food program in 2024. So next slide, please. So this slide gives you a look at what we're moving forward on with the expansion of the local food program in 2024. It is going to expand to all Colorado school districts that are enrolled in that universal meal program. The funding is going to go way up. We are going to have a minimum of $9 million available throughout the state for local food purchases. So the funding basis that was 5 cents per meal is going to go up to 25 cents per meal. And then small districts that are part of the program will receive a minimum of $5,000 for local purchases, just in case that 25-cent calculation doesn't really add up to much for a district that might have just a couple hundred kids. 25% of the funding will still be eligible for those value-added products, but other costs will be allowable too. So 10% of the funding can go towards the operating costs of the program, and then 12% can go towards the formation of advisory committees, which is a new requirement of the program. Schools that are enrolled will be required to set up parent-student advisory committees that are reflective of the racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic demographics of the district. This is really to bring in that community input into school meals. They'll be advising on cultural relevancy of meals, nutrition, and appeal. We're keeping the technical assistance aspect too. So an additional $5 million is going to be awarded to a nonprofit that will continue to provide farm to school technical assistance. The program is going to be monitored using tracking spreadsheets that we have already been using through the pilot years. So it's just a simple Google sheet that districts record their local food purchases on and that we monitor routinely. And then we will also be conducting audits with some select schools in the program as a part of their review process. All right, so next slide. All right, to give you a little snapshot of our pilot years with the local food program and some of the data that we found. So it's important to note that our pilot years prioritized schools that served less than 250,000 meals annually. So it left out some of our larger districts. And it also prioritized schools with a greater than 25% free and reduced lunch student population. Participation in the program has gradually increased. We started out with 18 in the first year and we're up to 31 this coming year. And some of the districts have participated in all years, but some are also new this year or just have participated in one of the years. So we publish a legislative report on this pilot program each year, and we've had one come out so far for school year 21-22. I think that report is coming in the chat too. But in the first year, we saw that $1.4 million was spent on local foods. And it's important to note that that's actually about 3 times the allotment for the local food program. So we asked schools not to just report on their local purchases through the program, but all of their purchases altogether. And we found that our districts are definitely prioritizing local foods. When you look at where the food comes from, most of it came from meat processors, but there was also local businesses, individual farms and ranchers, and some distributors. Some of the top purchases, apples, carrots, pears, and potatoes, and then beef played a huge role as well with us being a beef state. And then I just wanted to mention that Colorado State University has been a huge partner in helping us to evaluate a lot of this data. All right, next slide. So some of our initial lessons learned and considerations for the program going forward, we're really working on streamlining our data processes. It's definitely been a challenge to get our data consistent and clean since reporting on local foods is so new. Sponsor and producer connections is still a challenge, and we're still working on creating more connection events, producer directories, and resources for those. We have found that food hubs and local food aggregators have been a key partner, helping to navigate some of the logistical and supply chain challenges. And then we found that our partners are key too. We're definitely not going at this alone. So nonprofits like Nourish Colorado, Hunger Free Colorado, CSU, our state agency partners have really been key. And yeah, just some additional considerations moving forward. We also have local food for schools cooperative agreement funding. Healthy school meals is going to provide for that universal meal component. And we're also looking on forming a better foundation for that advisory committee that is going to be a requirement of the local food program. All right, so thank you all for listening. That is what I have for today.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, and I really love the student parent advisory committee thing. I think that's unique to Colorado, and it makes sure, as you mentioned, that these foods are really reflective of the communities that they serve, the students. So I think that's something a lot of other states can learn from and move forward with. So thanks for sharing that journey from pilot to established growing program. We're excited for what you have next. So now we're going to hear from Kate Wheeler. Kate is the Farm to Fork Specialist of Utah State Board of Education. And Kate will be sharing about the Farm to Fork Enhanced State Reimbursement Program. Kate?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Cassandra. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I started at Utah State Board of Education in 2016 and took over the farm to school position in early 2017. And at that point in time, we had a couple schools who were doing really fun things with local food, but nothing was really happening in terms of statewide coordination. And a lot of that was because the time for farm to school in my role was very limited. And historically it had just been, well, you can answer questions for schools if they have them. And what I started hearing when I came in and started looking for data was the two most common barriers we were hearing from schools was we need a list of farmers so we know where to buy from, and local food is too expensive. So great, those are solvable problems. So I started investing a lot of time into those two things. And this has been a really exciting time for local food in Utah. So in 2017, also, our legislature passed a bill to form a local food advisory council that was tasked with working on improving our local food economy. And so I was able to get on a work group for that council right at the beginning and make the case for a local reimbursement program to the legislators running the council. And they worked with us to request legislative funding through a couple different avenues. We tried appropriations, we tried a bill. Over 3 years, we were not able to get funding that way. One thing that is really unique in Utah is we have a very high tax on our liquor sales. And by law, our school meals receive 10% of those revenues. So our programs are actually really well funded in a lot of ways compared to other states. And in 2020, when our farm to school bill did not pass, the school breakfast bill did. And part of that bill, just like a small detail, required a rewrite of our agency's board rule regarding how the liquor tax was actually allocated out to schools. And so we were able to include $250,000 to pilot a local reimbursement program in that rewrite. I have pilot in quotes because there's no sunset attached to it, no performance requirements. So really that's just money that we have going forward unless they notice, or we don't want to speak that into existence, but it's not actually a pilot. And I'm sharing this background not because I think the specifics are a model you can adopt in your own state, but the broader lesson here is that farm to school is about partnerships and relationships, right? And I spent a lot of time building relationships with people over the years that we were trying to get funding. And that's what opened the door to include this project in our board rule rewrite. So next slide, please. So our program started in the 2021-2022 school year. We used minimally processed foods using the USDA unprocessed definition for geographic preference, just to kind of be consistent there, and grown in Utah. The justification for this project was that it was going to improve meal quality. So that's why we're not taking processed foods. We also really don't have processors in Utah making school appropriate value-added foods. So we don't have anyone using like Utah wheat to make a really great whole grain cracker or anything. So we didn't really feel that people were missing out on the funds by that. And then Utah grown because it's Utah tax dollars. The way we have been tracking it so far is that our schools they have a tracking spreadsheet. They're supposed to just sort of track their purchases throughout the year, submit it at the end of the year, and we calculate their reimbursements. What actually happens right now is in June, they all panic and they call their distributor and they say, "What local food did I buy?" And it's stressful. And then they send that in at the end. We have reserved the option to pull invoices to validate those spreadsheets as part of the procurement reviews, but it just hasn't been necessary yet. We also have a tiered reimbursement structure, and I don't know if I can explain this in the time limit we have, but the idea was to incentivize continued improvement and additional local purchases. So, we have some schools that have bought local apples every October. We want to reward them for that, but we also want to incentivize them to continue to make more local purchases. So there's different tiers they can hit. Right now, the cutoffs, it's compared to their overall percentage of how much food they're buying as local food they're buying as a percentage of their total food purchases. And the tiers right now are less than 1% or more than 1%. We were hoping to start at 10, but that's not where they're at with their purchases. And so the top tier, everybody this year got a flat amount of $5,000. Tier 1 got 10 cents per meal also, and tier 2 got 4 cents per meal. Even with that, many are receiving more reimbursement than they actually spent on local food. So it's a really nice incentive right now. Next slide, please. So in year 1, we included dairy, and that was based on school feedback. They were like, "We want to include milk. It'll just be easier for us." And, milk is just one of those things that every one of these programs has to deal with. And we didn't want to incentivize milk, but we did want to promote the idea that milk is local. A lot of our schools aren't even promoting that piece yet. And we figured, well, since we're comparing them to each other and they're all buying local milk, that'll cancel out. It won't give anyone an advantage over anyone else. Then when it's time to submit their tracking sheets, they were so upset about having to list their milk purchases and complaining about how much time it took and why weren't they getting more money for all this local milk that they were already buying this whole time. We also had some folks submit for only local milk and no other products, which really wasn't our point. So we removed the milk for this year. And there were some complaints about that, but overall it took them a lot less time to do the tracking, which is really important. We still included cheese, yogurt, sour cream, things like that. If the processing plant is using over 50% of Utah product, because that was another sticky piece, was all that milk gets mixed together and sometimes you don't know if some of it came from Idaho. So we worked with Dairy West, which is our local dairy association, on that piece of it. And then we're also looking at the possibility for the future of including border states within a certain mile radius, but based on what we're seeing right now, it might not be worth it. So I will talk about that on our next slide, please. Results wise, we've had very low uptake. We've only had 15 SFAs the first year and 10 of them this year that submitted. And what we're getting is a lot of disappointment from them that they're not buying more local food, but it's because they didn't try to do it. They're like, "Well, I asked my distributor and this is what they said." And that's really upsetting. I'm like, it sure is. So we have a little bit of a misconnection there. Some of our folks who are buying local are also not submitting for reimbursement because they feel like it's too much work. One of the things in conjunction with this, we've just finished a long strategic planning process, and something that came out of this was that the real problem our schools are facing is that they're not included in or connected to their school community and they don't feel appreciated. So our food service programs are really facing this much different barrier. It's not actually we can't buy local. It's why would I buy local? Because nobody here cares what I do. So next slide, please. What we're looking at doing next is we're going to keep trying the program because we have the funds and kind of keep assessing. We are including our producers that we've contracted with for local food for schools funding and hope that raises the visibility. We're going to just try to keep marketing the program. There's still very low awareness level. And then as part of that strategic plan that I mentioned, we are adding in other activities to support local procurement, including some peer learning groups. We have one focused on food buyers. We're doing movement building nights to help connect farm to school to local food throughout the communities. And then we're adding some specific one-off promotional events. So we do Apple Crunch every fall. We're adding a summer squash event in the summer and a meat event in April. I want to stress that one-time events are not our end goal, but they do help build that capacity and excitement. So we're going to just keep trying and see how that goes. I think I'm at time, but happy to answer questions later.
Kate, thank you so much for that. We have a quick question. It's just how many SFAs are in Utah for context of the results you shared?
Yeah, we have about, it's growing every year because we have a lot of charter schools, but I think we're at about 140 right now. But about 40 of those are district and the rest are charter schools, which are mostly single sites.
Great. Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks for just sharing about the journey and how you've made changes between year 1 and year 2 and really sharing that it's about elevating the school food profession, and there's more than just incentives. And I think a lot of states are trying to add different grant tax or different other support to really build the farm to school movement rather than just a monetary incentive. So amazing story. Thank you for sharing with us. And next we have Wendy Crawley. Wendy is the Farm to Program Consultant at Michigan Department of Education. And Wendy will be sharing about the 10 cents a meal for Michigan's Kids and Farms program. Wendy.
Hello, everyone. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about 10 cents a meal for Michigan's Kids and Farms. It started with a conversation at the Michigan Good Food Charter in 2010. And one of the goals that came out of that charter was a local food purchase incentive program before my time, and turned into a pilot in 2013. And in one region of the state, and then grew to become statewide in 2021. So, you know, it's a slow process, like the story that many of you have told. But starting with 2021 also included all child nutrition program sponsors. So child care centers, summer food service sponsors, community service agencies, anybody who participates in a child nutrition program. So that gives us the potential of having as many as 1,200 grantees if we include all of those types of sponsors. We have about 760 school districts, including charter schools in Michigan, and then those additional ones are non-school sponsors. Our program is funded at $9.3 million again for this year, and those are primarily school state aid dollars. So we're really lucky that our legislature prioritizes that, and we had to find a workaround to pay non-schools with school state aid dollars, but you know, it works. We also have specific funding in our legislation to support our partners, which I think is unique amongst many of these programs. So written right into the legislation provides a percentage of the total dollar amount to support our partners. So the Center for Regional Food Systems is one of our partners. They do evaluation work, and then we have outreach partners. I'll talk about our partners in a couple slides. The goals of the program, as written in the legislation, are to invest in local purchasing, to build that community and economic development, to build partnerships across farm to institution, and also to provide education and marketing about food and local produce for children in schools. Next slide. The way that our calculation works is similar to some of the previous ones. It's 10 cents times any meal you served last year in a federal child nutrition program. So we add breakfast, lunch, supper, snack across summer food service, child and adult care food program, and national school lunch and breakfast. So for example, if you served 456,000 meals times 10 cents, your maximum award would be $45,600. It requires that it be Michigan grown, minimally processed fruits, vegetables, and dry beans. So our program does not include dairy or meat or grains. We do that same definition of minimally processed, which includes washed, dried, packaged, and frozen, but not cooked or canned. We have a lot of conversations about applesauce and canned beans here in Michigan. Our grants are the basic sort, so they only support food purchases. We have talked over the years about trying to get some mini grants to support some of those other activities, but we've not gotten there yet with our legislature. It is a matching grant. So if you receive that $45,000 award, in the example above, you would need to spend $90,000 on local food in order to receive all of your $45,000 back. There's no penalty for not spending it all though. So we try and encourage grantees to request the maximum and then just do their best. In the last few years, there have been lots of unique challenges, and it's doing a lot extra. But in Michigan, it's pretty hard to buy an apple that wasn't grown in Michigan. So we tried to tell people to just start with apples, right? Everybody's already buying apples. Why wouldn't you get some money back for those apples? Also, the commodity sliced apples, the packaged sliced apples that schools can buy with their commodity entitlement dollars in Michigan are all also grown and packaged in Michigan. So that's a really great starting point for us to try and convince. And then even though they use commodity entitlement for those purchases, those can count for the matching part of their grant. So then they can use the other piece of their grant to actually purchase, local or farm fresh or, all those other kinds of food. They're required to do an evaluation survey annually. There are 3 evaluation surveys, and then they are required to upload their invoice data just on a spreadsheet, just like sounds like almost everybody else does. Next slide, please. So our partnerships are really our most important thing too. So the question you asked, Cassandra, was what is your, biggest takeaway? And ours is, we couldn't do this without this partnership that we have. The legislation specifies that the Department of Agricultural and Rural Development is a partner with us. Plus we use our percentage funding to partner with the Center for Regional Food Systems and the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities. So I'm not going to read all of this, but basically we at the department do administration and claims and questions and technical things. MDARD handles connections with farms and connecting with the Ag Council and food safety training. The Center for Regional Food Systems is our evaluation partner. They do a really great annual evaluation summary. They handle all of the survey feedback and answer questions for our grantees, and they're our food systems resource. And then Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities is our storytelling partner. They handle our social media, our website, our documents, and our branding. Next slide, please. So we do also administer local food for schools. So we are excited to be collecting data on dairy, meat, eggs, and grains from local food for schools purchases so that we can use that data to perhaps lobby to expand to those items. In addition to the fruits, vegetables, and dry beans that are allowed through 10 cents a meal. We are also leveraging the USDA formula funds to states. We've hired another person to help do some of this work with those formula funds. She's also going to support the farm to school census, and we're talking about expanding a farmer perception survey that was done by our MSU Center for Regional Food Systems partner a decade ago, more than a decade ago. We're also connected because of all of these partnerships with 3 new really cool projects that are coming: a Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure Program, the Great Lakes Midwest Regional Food Business Centers, and the Lake Michigan School Food Systems Innovation Hub. And we hope that all of those things together are going to help us solve some of those problems that many of you mentioned about access to farms and processing in the middle of the supply chain and developing food hubs and all of those same barriers that we have with schools. And Michigan is also just passed a universal meals legislation, or not legislation, but funding for a year for it. And so we're working to integrate that too.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to go back for sharing the story of the 10 cents meal program in Michigan. You started from a small regional pilot and now have expanded your funds every year to this huge program that's really revered in the state. And I think something you mentioned, I just want to echo, is the specific percentage that's allocated for partners. I think is really unique and supportive, because we know farm to school is all about partnerships. And then, yeah, trying to figure out how some schools are already buying local through other federal programs. And I think the 10 cents a meal has found a really unique way to incentivize local purchases, regardless of the state program or the federal program. So thanks for sharing that and about these other food projects in Michigan. And as the host, I get to decide that I will ask you a question midway, because I think we're doing well on time. But Erin asks a clarifying question, which is, if grantees request the full amount and they don't use it, what happens to that money? Does it get repurposed? And is there pushback on you if not all of the amounts are used? So Wendy, do you mind? Yeah.
So not yet. There hasn't been pushback because we've successfully messaged that there's been a series of really unusual circumstances in the world for the last few years, right? Food service directors don't have any staff. The USDA has changed the way that kids are fed every year for the last 3 years. But I would not be surprised if there starts to be pushback. The money does not get repurposed. It goes back to the state legislature, but they continue to refund us. But we are trying really hard to get that spent. We have the same sort of number. We have about 250 grantees, and only less than 50% of them actually submitted claims last year. So we're really working hard to provide one-on-one technical assistance for all the same reasons that everybody said. So not yet, but we're expecting. We need to start doing a better job.
Great, thank you for that. Next, we're going to hear from Connor Floyd. Connor is the Grants Program Manager of Child Nutrition Programs at the Vermont Agency of Education. And Connor will be speaking about the Local Foods Incentive Grant.
Thank you, Cassandra. So yeah, I started my position at the Agency of Education right around 2 years ago. And my position was actually created as a part of this new local foods incentive. And so my role in the incentive came once it was already created. And for me, it was really more of a question of, okay, how are we going to build this from the ground up? You can jump to the next slide. So first, I just want to do a little overview of our program. The local foods incentive for us, it has 2 parts. And so the first part is this baseline year grant. And the idea behind this was to provide an on-ramp to schools as they try to increase their local purchasing. The legislature realized that it's going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to be a systems change approach when you do want to dramatically shift the amount of local food that you're purchasing. And so in this first year, this is the first year that SFAs would apply. They're only going to receive this grant award once. There's no purchasing threshold required. Instead, we ask a few questions that are really geared towards getting the SFA to think about what aspects of their program they need to change. And then for those that apply and receive this grant, they receive 15 cents per lunch served in the previous school year. And for us, all of these grant awards are based on National School Lunch Program lunches served. Once schools have applied for and completed that baseline year grant, every year after that point, they'd be applying for a subsequent year grant. And this is really kind of the meat of the program once we onboard, hopefully, all of the schools in our state. And so once you hit that subsequent year, that's where you need to meet, for us, a minimum local purchasing threshold of at least 15%. And we've tried to make that application really simple by rolling it into a different data collection that we already collect each year. And I'll talk about some of those tracking requirements a little bit later on. And our program is funded at $500,000 per year. And we've gone through 2 cycles of the program thus far and haven't hit that $500,000 ceiling yet. And jump to the next slide. So thinking about subsequent year award tiers, for Vermont, this is an incentive program, so we're hoping to see growth. We don't want to just hit one number with schools. We want to see them continually trying to improve their percentages. And so we have 3 separate award tiers. That 0 to 14%, there's no award. So we have had schools that have geared towards trying to make more local purchasing, have done all that tracking, and have come up at 12, 13%. And unfortunately for those schools, we're not able to offer them any funding. Once you get past that 15% threshold, though, there's 3 separate tiers. So we have 15 to 19% where schools will receive that 15 cents per lunch. 20 to 24% is 20 cents per lunch. And then 25% and above, schools receive 25 cents per lunch served. So thinking about last year's results, this was the first year where schools could be applying for a subsequent year. And so we had 23 school food authorities that had applied for a baseline year and were now eligible in school year 23 to apply for a subsequent year grant award. Of those 23 school food authorities, 15 of those actually reported to us what their percentages were. And in our data collection, they know as they're applying whether or not the school is going to receive that grant award. They know what their percentage is. And so 5 of those schools applied and qualified for a grant award. 10 of those schools applied and did not receive a grant award. We appreciate those schools that still shared that information with us because it was useful to see where they were in the process. So we saw those percentages are the local percentages of those 5 school food authorities that did manage to hit 15% or higher. For us with these grant awards, once we award that funding to the school food authority, it's theirs to do whatever they would like to with that money. We're not looking to track it or tell them how to spend those funds. And just for context, we have about 70 school food authorities in our state. You can jump to the next slide. So this is probably more detail than we need to jump into, but just some context around how we're calculating this. And I think the important takeaways for us is that when we're thinking about what foods are considered to go into this tracking, we exclude all milk expenses. So when we're talking about hitting 15%, that keeps milk out of the equation. We also exclude all non-program food expenses, so vending machines, catering, a la carte. And we also don't include USDA foods or DoD fresh in this program at all. The tracking is required. And for tracking, we've offered 3 different options for schools. So they can either use a template that we created with a few of our partners. Schools can create their own Excel spreadsheet if they'd like to, or they can use their accounting codes, essentially. For us, what's really important is to just be able to look back at what they'd spent and track it to that specific invoice. Yeah, we can jump ahead to the next slide. And so then one really thorny issue for us in our process was what counts as local. And I feel like in my role, this hadn't really been talked about a lot until we got into it. And so for Vermont, we use a local definition that's prescribed by the legislature. There's 3 different distinct categories. There's your typical raw agricultural products, there's processed foods, and then there's these unique food products. You can check out the link if you want to. It's a really nuanced definition. And the question for me was, who's checking to make sure that this is local or not? Because that's outside of my wheelhouse. That's not my expertise. And our partner agency, Agency of Agriculture, also wasn't in the business of deciding who was local or who was not local. And so what we decided upon was we're going to put it on the businesses, and we have some attestation templates. And essentially, if that business provides that letter either to a nonprofit partner or the school itself confirming that it's a local product, we'll accept that. And Vermont Feed, one of our nonprofit partners, has been doing a lot of work building a database around what products count as local. You can jump to the next slide. And then one thing I just want to pitch is if you are interested in diving more deeply into our specific program and hearing some of these strategies, I believe next week I'll be hosting a webinar as a part of our Child Nutrition Summer Institute with 3 food service directors that did hit that 15% threshold. And we're really going to dive into the nitty-gritty of what they did to make it happen. Thank you so much. That's all I've got.
Yeah, thank you, Connor. Thanks for sharing this opportunity with us. It sounds like a really great way to dive deep into the weeds with you next week. And yeah, thanks for just elevating like verification and documentation and definitions of local. I think all of that is very front of mind for folks who administer or participate in these programs. So thanks for sharing that and your experience in Vermont. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Sam Gibb from the Food Trust. Sam is the Senior Associate of Farm to School, and she will be talking about Pennsylvania's Farm to School grant and quarterback for local pilot for ECE sites. So Sam, take it away.
Thanks so much, Cassandra. Yeah, so as Cassandra mentioned, I'll be talking about these two specific programs related to local food purchasing here in Pennsylvania. And I'll also share a little bit about the next steps and opportunities that we're considering as we finalize our plans to secure a statewide LFPI in our state, because we don't have one yet, but we're very excited. And thanks to all of you who've been paving the way, speakers here on this Flash Talk and last week's and all the learnings that you've been gathering. It's been really useful for us too. But before I dive in, I also just want to mention that since 2007 in Pennsylvania, we've had a form of farm to school legislation in place that has funded local food purchasing in some way, and the legislation and funding has evolved over the years. And I'll mention that a little bit, especially as related to the PA Farm to School grant in a moment. But also by way of background context, I work with the Food Trust, which is a nonprofit and also happens to be the coordinating agency for the Pennsylvania Farm to School Network. So I coordinate and collaborate with a bunch of different people who represent the Departments of Education, Agriculture, and Health, as well as nonprofit associations representing food service, agriculture, early childhood education, and public health. And as many already mentioned on this Flash Talk, partnership and collaboration is really critical to LFPI, but also all of our farm to school activities for the Pennsylvania Farm to School Network, and is obviously driven by our intentional structure that we've set up for our leadership team. And the last thing of note is that in 2020, as part of a broader strategic planning process, the network launched a set of working groups, and that includes a policy working group, which is now primarily focused on the goal of securing statewide funds for an LFPI. Next slide. So our Pennsylvania Farm to School grant is a competitive grant program that was established in 2019, administered by the Department of Agriculture with an annual budget of $500,000. And applicants can receive up to $15,000 with a 25% match requirement. And this grant would be considered one of the expanded incentive programs because the funds can be used for all general farm to school activities. Applicants can utilize funds for educational experiential activities, but are also very much encouraged to use funds to procure, serve, and market PA grown agricultural products in their cafeterias. And now in this past cycle, we have made some adjustments so that it's eligible for K-8 school-aged kids, as well as early care and education centers. And as I mentioned earlier, this has evolved over the years. We used to, when it initially started, it was just K through 5th grade. And then mostly due to feedback from interested applicants, we realized that it would be useful to expand and obviously ask for additional funding as we did that. There's also been some challenges as we've been adjusting the legislation and changing some of these eligibility requirements. So in the most current rendition of this bill, the term center even for an ECE site has actually made it exclusive to some ECE sites that are more family-based. So that's another consideration that we're taking, that we're thinking about as we kind of think about new renditions of the Farm to School grant program in the future. A couple other things I want to mention about this grant program is that it is a lump sum, not a per meal reimbursement for any local food purchasing. And the tracking required is pretty minimal. So we haven't necessarily had a lot of learnings related to tracking and administrative components as it relates to a local food purchasing incentive. And what's allowed is local fresh PA grown food and minimally processed items, but school garden produce and processed products in which most ingredients are not grown locally are excluded. The next slide. The second program I'll mention is the Quarterback for Local, and this is a pilot administered by the Food Trust. It's also a competitive grant opportunity specific to ECE sites who participate in the CACFP program. It's a relatively small pilot. It serves just 2 sites in Philadelphia, one that has 250 students and the other with 400 students, and it's funded by 2 foundations. We received originally just $30,000 for this current year, and then we just recently got an additional $70,000 to extend the pilot for the 2 existing sites, and we plan to also add 1 or 2 additional sites this coming year. But one big learning we had is that getting the pilot up and running during the fall and winter last year took more time than we originally expected. specifically related to helping connect the ECE sites with farmers and producers, and due to the timing of the growing season, obviously. In addition, there's obviously a pretty steep learning curve with ordering and processing local food and maintaining the necessary tracking systems to receive the reimbursement. That goes for the ECE sites and the folks who are doing that work on the ground, but also for us as the administrator. So the additional funding and extended time for these sites is really needed, and 1 year is just not long enough for any stakeholders involved to adjust their existing purchasing practices and build upon, you know, the initial relationships and adjustments that they make. Next slide. So I'll just cover a couple of learnings from both of these programs. I'm not going to mention all of them on the slide, but I did want to highlight one around food hubs and aggregators. One of our ECE sites in the Quarterback for Local is working with the Common Market, a food hub that serves Mid-Atlantic area. And because it was really challenging for the ECE director to actually know which products were Pennsylvania grown, she just requested a phone call each week where the person at Common Market could just tell her, here's the things that we have available. What do you want that are only Pennsylvania specific? Which I thought was just a creative example of how food hubs can also work to support and adjust their practices to make it easier for these statewide policies that usually have to be focused on state products. And then also the tracking local products in order to be reimbursed is cumbersome and time intensive. And I guess the one other highlight or example I'll give here is that the kitchen administrator at one of the ECE sites reported spending 4 to 6 hours each month on their weekend, their time off, to do the necessary tracking on top of an additional 8 to 10 hours throughout the month, generally spending ordering, processing local food, and menu prep. So we have, next slide. We have a lot of momentum and opportunity for growth here in Pennsylvania. There's no shortage of schools and kids, and obviously no shortage of farms, as you can see here from the stats on the slide. And we've seen some really great momentum with the PA Farm to School grant, although it's a small percentage of the overall schools and farmers that could be served across the state. You can see by these numbers that the interest and the popularity of purchasing local food is growing. So we know that we need to work towards an LFPI to be able to meet the needs across the state. And that leads us to what we're currently doing in our strategy phase. So you can go to the next slide, Cassandra, the final slide. As I mentioned, this is our top priority, and we really are in the design phase, learning from the expertise all across the nation and especially here in the state as well. It's worth noting that our Department of Education received funding from a Farm to School grant to do interviews with stakeholders, like a lot of folks who are on this call from 6 other states about their LFPI model, and also interviewed our stakeholders, a set of stakeholders here in Pennsylvania. And the summary of that report will be released soon, and that will help us at the network level and our policy working group finalize our strategic plans around passing an LFPI in the near future. And the 2 other things that I just wanted to mention that are opportunities among the other national opportunities like local food for school funds is the School Meals for All momentum in PA. This was the first legislative session where we were able to introduce a bill led by our School Nutrition Association here. And out of that, we were able to get free breakfast and also free lunch for students who previously paid for reduced price lunches, which is a first in Pennsylvania. Although the full legislation didn't totally pass, those are huge short-term wins. And there's quite a few legislators who are passionate about local food for schools generally, but we know having support from both sides of the political aisle is imperative in our state's climate. And then the last thing, which I know a link will be dropped in the chat about, so I won't share too much about it, but newly established as of last December is a PA Food Policy Council, which brings together representatives from a variety of state agencies. And we think that this could be a really great avenue to be able to make recommendations at the broader state level to our governor about what's needed generally for food for schools. So in summary, we have a lot of qualitative data and quantitative data that we are in the process of evaluating. And we know there's a lot of momentum, and we're just excited to make LFPI policy a reality in our state soon.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for closing it out for us. We are super excited for all you've done and continue to do, and looking forward in Pennsylvania. So thank you. all of our presenters today. And especially thank you, Colleen Max, for being the chat master over here, entering all of those links. We really appreciate you. I see we have a few questions, and of course, please enter your questions in the chat and we will get back to you either in follow-up or right now. Let's see, Erin, I see your question about ECE legislation, so I'll be happy to include that in follow-up and include some examples for you and everyone else on the call. I see Wendy responded as well. I'm going to jump to a question from Nick. It's for Justin. So Justin, how are you partnering with local food hubs to bolster the Colorado local food program? Are you able to pay these typically smaller businesses in net terms that make sense for them? Or are you coming up against barriers in payment administration for small producers partnering with the state agency and its funding?
Yeah, so I got to answer Nick directly through the chat, but I guess so we get a lot of regular feedback from food hubs and individual producers and how they're navigating the purchases. And one thing I just mentioned, probably the biggest challenge that comes up is just navigating like the bid process and procurement regulations that schools have when working with these smaller players. So we're trying to push out a lot of training and resources around that right now, helping them to navigate that process. Also, when we get schools involved in farm to school, we really encourage them to use micro purchases and those micro purchase thresholds, which are often like the smaller purchases for those local foods, and they don't require competitive bids necessarily. So that's always a nice point of entry for a lot of our schools when they're working with smaller producers and food hubs.
Excellent. Thank you. Connor, Wendy asks, can you talk more about how SFAs calculate and report local purchases? Are they already required to identify this, or is this an additional step in your program?
Yeah, so for the past couple of years, it's been required for schools to provide us with an estimate of what their local purchasing is, and then also a level of confidence of that estimate. So there's no tracking there. Frankly, we don't put a lot of weight behind those estimates because they're really all over the place. So the actual tracking and reporting of exactly what their local percentage is, that's a new requirement, and frankly, it's a fairly large, it's a pretty big administrative burden. We have done our best to keep our requirements as common sense and basic as possible, but to be able to really accurately come up to a percentage and track each purchase back to, we need to be able to track any purchase that they report back to an invoice and some kind of attestation showing that it's Vermont local. So that could either be the invoice saying that it's Vermont apples, or it could be literally a letter from the producer saying we qualify because of this. We try to make it easy, but they still need to get that letter. That's made a little bit easier with that database that I shared, where our partners Vermont Feed is doing a lot of that legwork. And schools are buying a lot of the same product, right? And so they're usually drawing from the same well there. But it is definitely, it's a lot of work, and really there's nothing more to it than getting down into the nitty gritty, and there is that additional burden. I think the one other thing I'd say is one option that we allowed are for those accounting codes to be used, so that, the food service director would just say, these lines on this invoice go to the local food code, the rest go to the program food code, and then it kind of flows right through their accounting software. We've seen some uptake on that. It's really kind of a, third split in terms of folks using our template, using their own spreadsheet, and using that accounting code method.
Thank you. All right, we're going to wrap it there. Thank you again to all of our presenters today in session 2 and last week's session 1. Thank you to our collaborators for this project, and thank you all for being here. We're going to share the contact info for these folks in our follow-up and other links and the recording. So please be in touch. Feel free to email me at any time, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.